So Long Ago by Elmer Boyd Smith. This is the story of a scientist named Dr. Peter and his nephew Bobby. Dr. Peter is taking his nephew on a trip back into prehistory to tell him the story of how life evolved on this planet. The book was written and illustrated by Mr. Smith in 1944, and many of the depictions and descriptions of the extinct animals that will follow are considered scientifically inaccurate by today's standards. Let's begin with a note. It is inevitable that I, as a scientist, looking at Mr. Boyd Smith's amazing creatures, would sometimes say, with Dr. Peter, I don't see why he behaves like that. We've worked out his habits quite differently. But the fact remains that I have very much enjoyed checking this manuscript and the pictures and think the knowledge presented is reasonably accurate. This is a picture story for children who are not yet ready for the more technical scientific account. It is Bobby's book, and not Dr. Peter's, and it is sure to put other Bobbies on the way of becoming Dr. Peter's. By Nelda E. Wright of the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard College. Beginnings. Long, long ago, the doctor explained, the world wasn't the world at all. It was a great ball of fire roaring through the sky. Nothing lived on it, and nothing grew on it. Not only because it was much too hot, but because the heat against the cold air made great clouds of steam. In time, the steam made rain, and the rain put out the fire, made brooks, and rivers, and lakes, and seas. That was how water came. Nothing can live without water. Then things began to happen. Under the water of the brooks and rivers and lakes, down in the cool mud, tiny living germs somehow started to grow. They were soft and shapeless at first. Then something like plants. Then some changed into near worms, others into crabs, fish, and so on. All this happened so slowly that if you had been there, you couldn't have seen it happen. It took years and years and years for the world to come alive. But it is the most exciting thing that has ever happened. And if it hadn't happened, you wouldn't be here. There wouldn't be any story at all. Bobby Reed sat up straight on the stool in Dr. Peter's office. Dr. Peter was Bobby's uncle and director of the Natural History Museum. Our chickens and cats and dogs didn't start that way, did they? Bobby asked. Everything, Dr. Peter said. Every single thing, from the mosquito to the biggest elephants, even the trees and all the growing things, came from this beginning. The bones, we call them fossils, that the animals left behind when they died, tell us this story. Our world begins to grow. At first, the little beginners in the mud just barely kept themselves alive on chemicals in the mud and water. What they needed, of course, were vitamins, and somehow they managed to grope around to find them. Then they began to wake up and grow. They grew eyes to find their food, mouths to eat it, and the more they ate, the more they wanted to eat. And before long, they even took to eating each other. The big ones ate the little ones and grew bigger until it was just eat or be eaten everywhere. Of course, this still goes on. We don't think anything of it because eating is a habit. Big hawks still eat little chickens, and little chickens still feed on little worms. Some of the big, hungry creatures that grew up in the old days got so fierce and so hungry that the others had to wriggle out of the mud onto the land to save their lives. This wasn't pleasant because the land was still hot, but somehow they found the cooler marshlands. These daring creatures came to be called amphibians because they could live either on dry land or in the water. As a matter of fact, we still have some leftovers from these old times. Salamanders, newts, and frogs can still live on land or in the water. Water plants moved out of the mud too, and before long some of the creatures began to eat plants instead of other animals. The next thing they did was to grow short, wobbly legs to crawl around with. Even snakes tried them, but gave them up later because slithering about suited them better. And so it was that real animals came to live on a hot and steaming land, and our world began to grow. Permian reptiles. The doctor showed Bobby how the animals, the fishes, and the plants all belonged to one great family, mostly cousins. But it was evident that they weren't a very happy family because eating was too important. The clams and oysters used to walk about in the beginning until some of the others discovered how good they were to eat. Then they dug down under the mud to hide. Even today, men dig them up to eat them. Millions of years went by. The world cooled off more and more, and as it cooled, life began to speed up. New creatures grew up, who were really the great-great-great-great-grandchildren of the amphibians. They were, for the most part, completely changed, but the changes had come slowly, and some of the creatures held on to something from their amphibian ancestors. Most of the creatures in the swamps had turned into what we call reptiles, and among them was a great shiny lizard with a tail fin on his back. Bobby watched him, busily chasing smaller creatures, not for play, but for a huge breakfast that seemed to go on and be lunch and supper and then breakfast again. Then Bobby made the mistake of asking Dr. Peter what this strange great lizard was called. "That," said the doctor, "is Dimetrodon incisivus, of the Pelycosauria family, a predaceous reptile from the Permian epoch." After that, Bobby watched without asking any questions. Nature tries experiments. The water and the food supply seemed to suit the reptiles, and they grew in numbers and in all sorts of ways. Some grew so large that they were like fairy tale monsters, and nothing dared to attack them. Some grew strong and became great fighters. Smaller ones grew to be quick and learned how to keep themselves alive by dodging and slipping away from their enemies. The Stegosaurus grew great bony armor plates which stood up on his back. Bobby thought him very ugly indeed and told his uncle so. "He may be ugly to look at, but he is a beautiful example of exaggerated specialization," the doctor said. "He carries a much bigger load than he needs." Nature made experiments, tried things out, and the results were often very queer indeed. As time went on, many of the little animals took to the trees for safety. Tree climbing and tree living started new changes. But life wasn't very easy for the creatures living in the trees. They had to come down to eat, and when they came down, they would be gobbled up. They had to work out some way to get food without being food themselves. They were hungry, and hunger sharpened their wits. They began to experiment with what in the end turned into flying. First, they learned to volplane, to leap and sail from tree to tree. Flying squirrels still do this today. As time went on, the pterosaurs grew lighter, perhaps because they didn't get enough to eat. And then wings, something like our bat wings, began to grow. At last they struck the right balance. They could fly, and they could laugh at the brutes below. "They do seem to be grinning," Bobby thought.